An overseer, an elder, then must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, temperate, prudent, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not addicted to wine, or pugnacious, but gentle, uncontentious, free from the love of money, must be able to manage his own household well, have his children under control. And you look at all of that character qualifications and you look in the mirror and say, not this fellow.
An elder also has a wife involved with him, though she has an enormous part, both in as an accountable partner, as a truth speaker when you think you're starting to believe your own stuff, but also to minister into lives of some of the women in the church where my effectiveness would naturally be limited.
In this segment, we discuss the critical role elders must play in assuring that new elders are qualified and God-called men. That is so critical for the life of the church.
What I find as a consultant that gets invited to minister to a church, and I find it helps sometimes to get them to see what Jesus, the implications of what Jesus has actually said. Because if the Spirit of God has not equipped every single elder with that responsibility and with the appropriate spiritual gifts, then it's almost impossible to have unanimity among the elders. They can't make decisions. It's like having a fish out of water in one case, because the Spirit is not resident or is not equipping this particular man. He's an elder for other reasons than the spiritual qualifications. And I find that frequently as a consultant, that I run into somebody who inadvertently has been made an elder, but he clearly is not equipped. I often ask a congregation, okay, I understand you folks make your decisions because you're democratic and everybody gets a vote as Democrats. We're real familiar with that. Not the political Democrats, but as a democratic society in the church operates. Well, let me ask you, what percentage of the people in your congregation, all of whom have a vote, are just new believers? And they answer. They'll think about it and they'll say, oh, well, maybe new believers, we may have 10 or 15% in that category. Okay, what percentage would you identify as just young believers growing and so forth, starting to mature and discover spiritual gifts? And they might say, 25 or 30% are a congregation, after they thought about it. And what percentage of them are really mature believers, long, growing, mature believers? And they might say, maybe 15 or 20%. So the final question is, what percentage of your congregation aren't believers at all? And that usually produces silence on the part of the people I'm talking to. And they think about that a while. And then I suggest to them, well, of those 4 percentages that we've concluded on, and you've told me about, which ones, from a wisdom standpoint, do you think should decide who your elders or who your pastors should be? And almost always the light goes on and they say, well, maybe the mature believers, or maybe a combination of mature believers and growing believers. Well, then does it make any kind of common sense to give everybody, including non-believers at all, who don't even have the Spirit at work in their life, living in their lives, choose who your leaders are, who your elders are, who your pastor will be? And then a whole different discussion takes place as they realize that it's a little bit like pushing water uphill from a wisdom standpoint to give everybody a vote in a democratic way. That Jesus' church should operate differently. And of course, that takes us then to the qualifications of elders in Timothy and Titus, and the qualifications for the pastor they choose. Are they just choosing somebody who has a great reputation, a real charismatic figure who has a lot of education behind them? Or are they choosing someone that the Spirit of God is equipped for that purpose?
The scriptures are in a couple of places pretty clear on qualifications of an elder. I'll read this from the book of Titus. For this reason I left you in Crete, that you might set in order what remains, and appoint elders in every city as I directed you. Namely, if any man be above reproach, the husband of one wife, having children who believe, not accused of dissipation or rebellion. For the overseer must be above reproach, as God's steward, not self-willed, not quick-tempered, not addicted to wine, not pugnacious, not fond of sordid gain, but hospitable, loving what is good, sensible, just, devout, self-controlled, holding fast the faithful word, which is in accordance with the teaching, that he may be able both to exhort in sound doctrine and to refute those who contradict. It is a good thing, as the scripture says, when a man aspires to be an elder. Not necessarily the office, but these characteristics that are given to us. These describe a godly man. And who wouldn't want to be this? And so, again, the role of an elder is to understand that it's God's mercy and grace in his life that has brought about some consistency in these areas, some confidence in these areas, and by the means with which God has brought that about in his life, he wants to likewise share that and employ that in another's life, that they might too come to maturity in the Lord. It seems rather important that at the beginning of this, he tells them to appoint elders in every city, as I directed you. So it's not just one possible form of government, but it seems this is God's chosen form of governance. And the description is simple. It's a man who is above reproach. This is a man of discipline. He's a man who senses how God is working, the truth that's happening in people's circumstances, and brings into that what God has taught. Immediately following these qualifications of elder, a man above reproach, a man whose life indicates that he's believed these truths and employed them in his life, and a man who is able to then speak them with exhortation and encouragement both. Immediately after it says because you have to realize in reality, this is what's going to come. There are many rebellious men, empty talkers and deceivers, especially those of the circumcision. The elder needs to be discerning of that and be in a position to settle that thing as well in the midst of the body, to keep the sheep from being led astray by those who are right there in their very midst. In the age of television, the internet and all, there's so much out there that's available to the body. An elder's role has taken on a technological aspect in a sense where he's got to be aware of some of these, widespread charlatans in a sense who are, drawing big crowds, 50,000 people in their auditorium every Sunday and preaching anything but the gospel. And yet it sounds good and it feels good. And the sheep show up saying, oh, I was listening to so-and-so and and you need to be able to look them in the eye and say, do you have a moment? Can we talk about this? Let's look back and see, hath God truly said that? So it's an interesting thing that he juxtaposes that right there to say this can get very serious in the midst of the people.
The elders start out being elders by spiritual gifts that the Spirit of God gives them. And those spiritual gifts are told us in Timothy and Titus. So there's a criteria that an elder meets. And really, if he has served the body, as Jesus was telling the disciples, the body itself, the body of believers, identifies these leaders ahead of time, because it's the same Spirit that works in the body, individual bodies of believers, that works that gives out the leadership gifts to the elders. And so it becomes a matter of demonstrating what the spiritual gifts have been given, and the men have responded to it and begun to exercise their gifts in terms of building up the body. And so the body says, oh, well, this fellow meets that criteria. They may not know all the ins and outs of what that spiritual gift requires in the end, but as they begin to understand, they naturally turn to this particular individual and they say, help us with this problem, or we need this, or in order to utilize our spiritual gift that we just develop it, just learned we have and have been developing. And so it's a mutual back and forth scene. And so elders then become, in a natural way, the shepherds of the sheep.
The elder is, first of all, identified as an elder by the body. The body themselves, the people themselves within the church, in watching the men around them, see in one or more of them characteristics of leadership, of strength, of consistency in their walk with the Lord, to which they're attracted. And they come and they say, can I talk with you? Would you help me? So the body begins to identify that these people are worthy of their ear. I need to hear from you. I want to learn from you. I enjoy being with you. I feel like I'm with Christ in a sense when I'm with you. Whoa, what an amazing thing. Beyond that, the elder has a sense of his own frailty, his own there but for the grace of God. In fact, as I like to say, there in spite of and in the midst of the grace of God go I all the time. And in need of the grace of God, I go and ask God for his mercy and forgiveness and goodness to overcome and take me back into that strong place I need to be with him. The body sees that as well, and they identify with that. There's a man of humility, a man who has been broken, a man who has the same frailty as I have. And yet he walks in a consistency with the Lord. So the first thing is that elder understands that, he recognizes it. Another distinction is that he's apt to teach. And here in Titus, it says that he's one who holds fast the faithful word, which is in accordance with the teaching that he's gotten already. So he's someone who's been able to take in the word, understand it in his own life, and then translate it into the life of others. And where the shoe gets binding, if you will, is that he may be able both to exhort in sound doctrine and refute those who contradict. And that's when it gets touchy. If he doesn't really know the word, if he hasn't been well grounded in the word, if he isn't dependent on the word and the God of the word, he's got nothing to say to these people who go, oh yeah, but what about so-and-so? Well, I thought such and such. No, you don't understand my background. Either the word is the word and it's true and it's effective, or it's not. Either God is who he is in his character, immutable, the same yesterday, today, and forever, or he's not. The elder must understand that and be able, in a winsome, careful way, sometimes exhortive and strong, tough love, if you will, way, say, au contraire.
In one particular church I was called to, they were having difficulties, and they did have a number of people who they identified as elders. And as I got more into the situation, began to question these people about what their responsibilities, they saw as their responsibilities and how they became in this position elders, I discovered that most of these men didn't really fit the qualifications that Timothy and Titus are in Scripture to teach us what the qualifications are. For example, their qualification, I recall from one man, was that he was a banker. He was a nice guy, a believer, of course, but he was a banker. That's the main contribution from his point of view. And then we, of course, had to have a lawyer on the board, and we had to have an executive officer of a company on the board. You got to have those things. And so I suggested to them, well, maybe we ought to restudy what the real eldership qualifications are, because they don't mention banker or financial officer or anything like that. And mind you, we had in the disciples some men that fit those kind of qualifications. You got a tax collector who is like an accountant, a chief financial officer, but that's never mentioned as one of his qualifications. And so we began by teaching we had sessions where we would teach and exposit the text as to what it meant to fit those qualifications. And we told the whole congregation as well. Well, in that process, over some months, a number of the elders, the leaders, said, well, I don't qualify. I don't have the spiritual gifts that are mentioned in those places. And so they took themselves off. And then we began to discover that the Spirit of God had equipped some other men that had never even been considered to be elders. And so we suggested they relook at this. And so some new elders came into being. And they had a woman elder. And I pointed out, and from a scriptural point of view, you put her in an impossible position. And I still remember they asked, what do you mean an impossible position? We got to have a woman's point of view. I mean, anybody would say that. Well, wait a minute. When is she to be submissive to her husband, and when is the husband is to be submissive to her as the elder of the church? You put her in an untenable position because she's being asked to do two contradictory things at the same time. When we discussed this with the group we were trying to help, the lady elder herself realized that she just hadn't been taught what the qualifications are. And without anybody saying anything to her, she just simply said, well, I don't fit those qualifications clearly, and I need to step down. And so the Spirit of God took care of that all by itself. Now, it doesn't mean that the woman's point of view isn't there. Every elder is to be married, for example. And so automatically in the marriage arrangement, they are one flesh, as the scripture clearly says. God has gifted her in such a way that not only is she a wife, as Proverbs 31 says, the heart of her husband trusts in her, Proverbs 31, but I really, in a conscious way, depend on what she thinks about this or that issue. Whether I'm teaching the scriptures as a preacher, or whether I'm a consultant, or whether I'm an elder making decisions with other elders on a whole thing, it just absolutely is true that her godly viewpoint is already built in.
I look back on this as a young man after I first met the Lord. I came to the Lord as a college student, and it was within a year or so, I had this burning desire to teach. And I just invited some friends to come over to this house that 3 or 4 other guys and I were renting, and to have a men's study in the book of Acts. And I had to teach. Well, where's that come from? Well, there you are. An elder is gifted. It has nothing to do with me. It had everything to do with God, who took this guy, who brought him to the Lord as a college student, out of death into life, and in the midst of that had put into me this need to teach. So that's another part that the body begins to see, is this man is actually apt to teach, in fact, accomplished in teaching, capable of conveying biblical truth into people's lives in a way that actually affects them in their walk with the Lord in maturity. The elders, the leadership of the church, should have their eyes open to these sorts of folks and be looking for where God is working through men and into the body, and finding them and drawing them in, building them up in the faith, maturing them, mentoring them as well, to a point where they could, in fact, be brought in as elders. So there's that step-by-step process. First, God at work in the body identifying, leaders seeing, and then taking it to the other level of an official recognition before the body.
My story on how I became an elder, to me, is interesting and probably a bit lengthy, because elders self-identify. Let me explain. I was in the Army in 1982, and the church asked me to come and be part of their staff. Now, I had known Ray Stemman, who was one of the pastors here. Bob Smith was an elder, and Paul Winslow was my good friend. And they all recommended to the Board of Elders that I become a pastor of Discovery Center, which was our intern program and our Discovery seminars. Well, that was fine, except the rest of the elders didn't know me. So I was hired as the director of Discovery Center, not as a pastor. Character takes time to evaluate. The Bible talks about an elder and how he is to function at home, to lead his family, how he's to have a good reputation within the community, how he's to have a whole bunch of character qualities that we aspire to. So how do you evaluate that? Well, you can only evaluate that when you watch somebody's life, and therefore it takes time. During that time, I started doing pastoral things. I taught interns. I counseled. I was in charge of a Sunday school class we called All Ages and Stages, about 150 folks, meeting right over here. And during that time, they were observing me. And quite frankly, I was getting to know the flock, because we had about 720 families in those days, and you can't really shepherd and take care of people if you don't know them. So I was getting to know them, spending time with them, etc. And I notice in John, the Gospel of John, chapter 10, that Jesus talks about the sheep, and he says, I know the sheep, and they know me, and they recognize my voice, and we have a relationship. So you need a relationship to shepherd.
It's always an amazing thing to me when I consider that I are an elder. What happened? Linda and I, my bride of 40 years now, talk about where God has us and the ministries that are before us, the roles that we have together, because an elder also has a wife involved with him, though she may not have the authoritative title. And so she has an enormous part, both as an accountable partner, as a truth speaker, as a bringer downer when you think you're starting to believe your own stuff, but also to minister into lives of some of the women in the church where my effectiveness would naturally be limited. We look at that and we marvel. We say, how is it this happened? I look back on my own walk as a Christian, the eagerness I had early on to teach the word, and the surprise it was to me at how guys showed up and they wanted to be a part of that. And oh gosh, I stumbled and along the way. And then we got into Bible study fellowship, and she and I together, there was a combined men's and women's class back in those days, one of the last two left in the world. And So she and I were involved there, and the leader of that eventually became an elder at Peninsula Bible Church with me. And he needed to step out, and he asked if I would be willing to become the teaching leader. And there again, a recognition of gift by a godly man, older man, saying, you have something that God is obviously doing. So again, it's a work of the Lord, identifying within the body the gifts that he has already put in place. It wasn't something I cranked up. I aspired to teach, but I never saw myself in this role. And so along the way, as I'm teaching this word and involved at Peninsula Bible Church, and men from the church are coming into this 200 men, it became an all men eventually, Bible study fellowship. Some from the church were there. The elders began to notice. And this one fellow who became an elder at PBC, Paul Winslow, likewise noticed. And then he recommended that I help lead the worship service on one Sunday morning. Again, a gift before people speaking. So, I mean, I'm all excited. I said, yes, because I want to be discipled. And now I'm at a place as a young Christian, young married man, who recognizes the need for older men to teach the younger. And in the setting where I was, that wasn't a concept that church understood of discipling, mentoring.
Yeah, in my case, the Lord used a lengthy process to get me ready to become an elder, to be an elder. I had a lot to learn, and it took about 17 years for that to happen. And but it was the right thing. I wouldn't have been ready any sooner than that. Well, I think if I had a plan as far as involvement in the life of this church, it wasn't very obvious. I just sort of did what was put on my plate. I was discipled by one of the pastors for a period of time. We spent time studying the scriptures together. He got me plugged into my first ministry involvement, which was the high school group here at church. And then leading a home fellowship group because I wanted to do something more with my wife. But the things that I needed to do was to season more in growing in my own ability to study the scriptures and apply them, teach them, and also gain in self-confidence. That was definitely not my strong suit. And even after I became an elder, I had to be encouraged to give input.
Here in 1 Timothy, it says, an overseer, an elder, then must be above reproach. Wow. The husband of one wife, okay. Temperate, prudent, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not addicted to wine, or pugnacious, but gentle, uncontentious, free from the love of money. Must be able to manage his own household well, have his children under control. And to look at all of that character qualifications, and you look in the mirror and say, not this fellow. So it was a process. And 1 Timothy also says not to lay hands on an elder too quickly.
I know after I was an elder advisor, I know they talked about me becoming an elder, but there wasn't unanimity on that. And it had largely to do that I hadn't really developed a confidence level. I haven't really found my own voice to be courageous enough to speak up in elders meetings about significant issues. So there just wasn't unanimity on me, and it was the right decision. And I received it and basically agreed with it, and just had to trust God to change me, which I think He did through time. But so every elder that since I've been at PBC, it's been every elder agrees that this is the new elder, and this is why we're doing it. I mean, first of all, he meets the descriptions of what an elder should be like character-wise, and also that he's been observed in ministry for a sufficient period of time, that he's got gifts of ministering, and that he knows the Word. All those things are crucial, and they need to be observed over a period of time. Paul even says, don't lay hands on a elder. He didn't say this elder candidate quickly, but lay hands on a man quickly, but take your time. Make sure that as much as you can before the Lord, that He is prepared to take on this role. Frankly, when I took it on, I didn't realize how hard it was going to be. And it may have a lot to do with my personality, but I struggle with emotions. I struggle with with hurting people's feelings, and sometimes you don't want to do it deliberately, but it's necessary to confront issues and take them on and deal with it. And that was hard for me. The elders are the ones that need to choose new elders, and they need to see a consistency in the life of the man they select or think God is wants to bring on the board. They need to see those qualities. Again, not perfectly, because we're not perfect, but they need to see those, and they need to see it over some period of time.
I must admit I was overwhelmed when they asked me to be an elder. And I was surprised, and I was delighted, but yet not at all disappointed that somehow the process had taken too long. Because as I started my explanation, it took them a while to confirm unanimously that I was a pastor. 2 years they watched. And then they took several more years to let me self-identify as an elder. And I think that's the way the process should be.